he thought that Brezhnev had been a dangerous liberal. He was a tough guy, was Kochemasov, although personally he was quite pleasant.
Welcome to Cold War Conversations.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
5, 2, 7, 1, 6, 6, 9, 8, 8, 3.
This is Radio Star Czechoslovakia, the legitimate voice of occupied Czechoslovakia.
And I'm here to host this final program from the German Democratic Republic for you.
This is part 2 of our conversation with Colin Munro, who was the British Deputy Head of Mission in East Berlin from 1987 to 1990. In this episode we move to the monumental events of 1989 as the GDR was wrought by internal protest prior to the opening of the wall in Berlin. It's a fascinating account of Colin's contacts who were giving him insights into the eventual fall of the GDR. Now, I could really use your support to help me to continue to produce these podcasts. A monthly donation of $4, £3 or €3 via Patreon will really help. And you will get the sought-after Cold War Conversations drinks coaster as a thank you and bask in the warm glow of knowing that you are helping to preserve Cold War history. Just go to coldwarconversations.com/donate. But if that's not your cup of tea, then leave a written review in Apple Podcasts or share us on social media. By telling your friends, you can really help the podcast grow. In today's episode, Colin tells of translating for Margaret Thatcher during a phone call with Helmut Kohl, UK imports from the GDR, and of a drunken Harry Tisch, the East German trade union leader. We welcome Colin to our Cold War conversation.
Honecker was attending a meeting of the Warsaw Pact in Bucharest, of all places, when he was taken ill. And he was invalided out of the conference. And he didn't appear again until just before the anniversary. So July, August, and September, these crucial months, the country was really leaderless, and nobody really knew what was going on or who was in charge. And then Honecker did resurface for these 40th anniversary celebrations, which were by this time the last hurrah, and Gorbachev's visit is now famous, and there was trouble going on in the streets outside, and Gorbachev's famous point, come too late, you get punished, people were sitting next to Gorbachev who could understand German and saying, this is the end, the GDR's finished.
Yeah, because also at this point, the West German embassy in Czechoslovakia was being...
Well, that's right, because this was, the East Germans made desperate efforts to... at one point, they actually tried to close the frontier to Czechoslovakia. And then people began to take, because the Czechoslovakia was still in the grip of the hardliners, and people were taking refuge in their. I think in the end it was thousands in the German embassy in Prague, and then there was Genscher's famous negotiation, and he negotiated with the Czechs and indeed with the East Germans, and it was agreed that that these people would be at liberty to travel to West Germany. But at this point, the East Germans made the most extraordinary mistake. They said that it had to be, as it were, a sovereign decision of the East German government to allow these people to leave. Therefore, they had to leave not from Czechoslovakia, but from East Germany. So they were put in sealed trains. And sealed trains which transited East Germany. And people tried to get aboard them at Dresden Station and so on. And sealed trains have the most dreadful echoes in Central Europe. People being transported to the death camps. People being transported to the Gulag. And so the symbolism of this was just, disastrous. Absolutely disastrous.
Yeah, and then Honecker is deposed in October.
Right. After by now, well, in September 1989, what you might call the new political forces began to appear. There had been meetings in the Protestant churches, and the Protestant church for some time. The Protestant church was important because it was an organization heavily infiltrated by the Stasi, but was not actually under state control. And what is more, they had infrastructures, like the Catholic Church in Poland. They had buildings. They had photocopiers.
Yeah.
They could organize meetings, and they could provide an element of protection. And so the political parties, the refounded SPD, the new political parties, the environmental movements, and all the rest of it took place, got going under the auspices or the umbrella of the Protestant Church. And of course, most famous of all are the peaceful demonstrations after the Monday prayers in the Nikolaikirche in Leipzig. And these demonstrations gradually sort of grew and grew and grew, and until it came to the famous the crunch one was whether the security forces would be turned on them or not. And in the event, as we all know, maybe Krenz played an honorable role. It's not entirely clear, but what is clear is that there was sort of a breakdown. This was a command and control system in East Germany, and there were no longer any commands, and there was no proper control.
Yeah.
And so, in the light of all this, the Politburo decided that they would have to that Honecker had to go, and he was forced into retirement, and Krenz was the anointed successor. But by now, things were really spinning out of control, and Egon stands for Geht auch noch, he'll go too. And Krenz went to Moscow right at the end of October. And my most interesting meeting with the Soviet embassy was to have a sort of debrief on the visit. And it was at this point that the Soviet embassy told me that they too thought that unification was a possibility, but that we had to be very careful. There was Moscow was not prepared for it. Things could spin out of control, and nobody knew who was giving orders to the Soviet forces in East Germany. That was...
the Soviet embassy didn't know that?
Well, you see, the Soviet embassy was headed up by an apparatchik called Kochemasov, who was a member of the Central Committee.
Right.
And he thought that Brezhnev had been a dangerous liberal. He was a real tough...
Wow.
He was a tough guy, was Kochemasov, although personally he was quite pleasant. The number two, became a great friend of mine, a chap called Igor Maksimichev, and he was a bit of a wobbler, but then he came firmly down on the side of perestroika, as did number three, who was perhaps the biggest brain in the embassy, a chap called Vladimir Grinin, who until recently was Russia's ambassador in Berlin.
Okay.
And they invited me to their embassy, Grinin and Maksimichev and one other guy, for a debrief on the Krantz visit. And it was a most extraordinary experience. They had on a big round table the protocols of the Potsdam conferences in 1945.
Right.
And they said, well, now, basically their message was the time has come to resume full power control of Germany. You control your lot, we'll control ours. Here are the things that we agreed on in 1945, and here are the things that we haven't agreed on and things we've got to agree on now. And we need to have a meeting of the four powers to sort of recalibrate the management of Germany.
Wow, so they were saying that they would take over the running of East Germany?
Well, no, they wanted, at this point, their policy was, to the extent that they had a policy, was that the two German states should stay as they were.
Yeah.
Okay, you could envisage democratization of East Germany, which, of course, is what initially the protest movement was asking for. The new political forces, they were the artists, the cultural vultures and so on. They wanted to turn East Germany into a sort of German Sweden, you see.
Yeah.
But this lasted about a month. And so the Soviet position was rather on those lines. But for this to happen, they argued that there needed to be that the Western Allies needed to exert control on the West Germans, and in the end, there was a meeting in the Allied Control Commission on the 11th of December, and it was ostensibly, and we agreed to it on this basis, it was to talk about Berlin air services, because ever since the end of the war, only airlines from the three Western countries could fly to West Berlin along designated corridors controlled by Soviet air traffic controllers. All the flight clearances and so on were agreed with the Russians in the control building in West Berlin every day since.
Yeah.
That was why the airplanes had to fly at 10,000 feet, because that was where airplanes flew in 1948. And so this, of course, air services arrangement was no longer, up to speed. And so it was agreed that there would be a meeting to discuss it. But of course, the optics were that this was the four powers telling the Germans what to do all over again. I may say, Mrs. Thatcher, who we might speak about later, she was in favour of all that.
Yeah, telling the Germans what to do. Yeah.
But the point was that these what you might call forward thinkers in the Soviet embassy could see the way things were going, and the point about them not knowing what was going on with regard to Soviet forces was because the Soviet embassy was split. There was a large KGB contingent. And remember, there was a KGB officer called Vladimir Putin in Dresden at this time.
Yes.
And the Soviet military high command in Moscow was giving the orders to the group of Soviet forces in Germany, as they were called. And probably Ambassador Kochemasov would know what was going on, but not untrustworthy diplomats like Grinin and Maximitchev.
Yeah.
So the tension at the Soviet embassy on the National Day on 7th of November was absolutely palpable. I mean, it was incredible.
Yeah.
So that's what I meant. That's what I meant by that. But it was also this what Greening and it coincides. And I sent a report on this to London, which was which I think that was. The Prime Minister saw it and all the rest of it. It was regarded as, also by the West Germans, as a key bit of sort of bit of evidence as to how the situation was unfolding in Moscow.
Yeah. And so there's the famous Shabovsky press conference.
Yes.
And is that when you first heard that the wall was open?
Well, I can tell you exactly. It's like Kennedy's assassination. Everybody remembers where they were on that day.
Yeah.
I was at a conference in the Reichstag in West, which is just over the border in West Berlin.
Yeah.
And it was one of these. There were endless meetings and discussions and visits and goodness knows what. And anyway, this I think there were a whole lot of Bundestag deputies from West Germany there, and we were having a drink at the end of the conference, and the host, the Minister for Inner German Relations, Frau Dorothea Wilms, was giving a nice little speech from a lectern, and then somebody came into the room and handed her a note, and she said, "I think you're going to all be very interested in this. This is what Gunter Schabowski has just said at the press conference in the evening press conference in East Berlin, sort of about 500 meters away at the press center." And I've never seen journalists part company with their drinks so fast in all my life. And so we all rushed off to our to our stations to find out what was going on. And in my case, that meant driving back home over Bornholmer Strasse. And I was pretty tired. Anyway, I thought I'll go via Bornholmer Strasse anyway, as usual, and I'll ask the Fopos what's going on. So I got to Bornholmer Strasse. This must have been about 7:45 or something. And there were a few people, a few more than normal, sort of milling around on the eastern side of the wall. I said, "What's going on? What's this stuff about Schabowski?" And they said, "We haven't heard anything. Nobody tells us anything." So I went home, and I told my wife what was going on, and we thought, well, we'll switch on the telly and see what's going on. And we were completely exhausted, I have to tell you. So we watched Heute Journal at 9:45, and they said the crowds were growing, but there was still no sign. The wall wasn't open or anything like that. So we went to bed, and the whole thing blew up at 10:30. And my wife was uneasy or something. She got up in the middle of the night and switched on the telly and saw these amazing scenes. And one of our more enterprising one member of the embassy had actually sort of stayed up all night and had gone with the flow and all the rest of it. It was absolutely, it's just amazing. And it was it was absolutely miraculous that it all happened so that it all happened peacefully. Not a shot was fired, nobody was in. And then, of course, over the subsequent weekend, the way, German efficiency, everybody got their Begrüßungsgeld, 100 marks. On the first night, they all got free beer.
Yeah.
And some of them got Begrüßungsgeld several times over, I have to tell you.
Well, I hear people were wheeling their, 90-year-old grandfather over the border to make sure that he got his Begrüßungsgeld.
That's right. I mean, I had the 11th, this was the 9th of November. 11th of November is the date on which Carnival kicks off, Fasching. And I used to play hockey, field hockey, for a team in West Berlin, which before the wall had gone up had players from the eastern sectors and so on. And anyway, I'd invited them to visit East Berlin for a Fasching party on the 11th. And so on the 11th, I went over to the West to make arrangements for my friend to escort my friends from my hockey friends from west to east, and we were amongst the very few people who were going in that direction. And it was and we had and one of the players had actually a few months before, he'd done a runner from East Germany, and he was very afraid, but we said, "Oh, everything's changed. You'll be all right now, my boy." And so these characters, and there were some quite amusing rough diamonds in this team, and they marched up to the Fopos and they said, "Well, where is our Begrüßungsgeld?" Brilliant. And one Fopo said, "Oh, so weit ist es noch nicht." It's not quite got to that stage yet, but who knows?
Yeah. That's brilliant. That is brilliant. What was the UK government's position? I mean, what did they tell you to do?
Well, now we come to Mrs. Thatcher. Mrs. Thatcher, as is well known, she tried to slow down German unification. She had been reading up on it during her summer break, apparently. And you see, she disliked Kohl intensely. In 1983, I did some interpreting on the telephone between the two of them, and they just talked past each other. And she resented Kohl, and she had one good reason for being worried about German unification, and that was if it got out of control, and the result was that Gorbachev got overthrown, that would be, to put it mildly, a sort of a bad outcome for East-West relations. That was her good reason. Her bad reason was, as I say, resentment and suspicion of the Germans and so on. And I did quite a lot of work on this 10 years ago, and we, together with the Foreign Office historian, so we found two remarkable records of conversation. One was with a conversation with Mitterrand on, I think it was the 3rd of, anyway, it was early September 1989. And she said to Mitterrand, it would be a disaster if Germany was reunited and we had the euro as well. As it in the end turned out, the euro was Mitterrand's answer of how, not a very good one, but it was his answer of how to control an enlarged united Germany if it should come to that. And we found that record in the French archives, not in our own.
Right.
And then, about 3 weeks later, she had a tete-a-tete with Gorbachev, and she said to the Gorbachev, "Oh, frontiers must stay as they are. Don't believe all this stuff about NATO being in favor of the unification of Germany. We aren't." Now, according to Number 10's record, it was Gorbachev who said that. But according to the Russian record, it was Thatcher who said it. And how do we know what Thatcher said? Because Gorbachev instructed his advisor, Chernayev, to go round to the West German embassy and brief them on what Thatcher had just said.
Right. And the West Germans had the record of what they were briefed on.
So the West Germans knew exactly from where she was coming from. And in the embassy in East Berlin, we were a bit mystified by all this, because we could see a real opportunity. The British, I think, have been the most consistent on our standpoint that Germany could be reunited if the conditions are right. And now the conditions were coming into view, and she was trying to overturn our policy.
Yeah.
And this Christopher Mallory, the ambassador in Bonn, had an extraordinarily difficult time. It's all very well recounted in his book about the Cold War, incidentally. Anyway, this sort of battle went on through several phases, and basically the officials were all who were in charge of our policy were weighing in as best they could to get her to change it, or to stop it, because apart from anything else, she certainly didn't have the support of the Americans. Mitterrand was using her to express his fears, and he was keeping his channels to coal open, and the Russians, as we would see, were on the cave anyway. It was a very, very bad moment, and we marginalized ourselves. It was one of the moments at which we seriously marginalized ourselves as a significant power.
Yeah.
And she's to blame for it.
Yeah.
I remember vividly when eventually Douglas Hurd came to see us on a visit to East Germany, and that was late January. It was far too late, 1990, and we were briefing him beforehand, and he said, "Well, what you're telling me is that this place doesn't have a future as a separate state." And so he said, "Yeah, that's right." Secretary of State said, "Okay, I'll tell her. She'll just have to get used to it." Which she did, and she did after a fashion. But she was still sort of stamping her feet. Months later, you remember the whole Ridley Spectator affair and all that.
Yeah.
Well, he was really expressing what she thought.
Yeah.
But it was the most extraordinary experience.
Yeah. And you were there till 1990, weren't you?
I was there until May 1990, and at that point, I moved to be Consul General in Frankfurt. So then I ran a view of our exit from the ERM, which is a sort of post-Cold War story.
Yeah. And when you left, I mean, you could see that, that the East Germany was going to be subsumed into West Germany, and
oh yes, the key event was that there were elections to the Volkskammer. They were originally scheduled for May, but then they were brought forward. The first key event was that after the fall of the wall, the economy went into an absolute tailspin. The GDR as a German, Sweden was history once the demonstrators began calling for Deutschland einig Vaterland and all that. That happened in the third week of November.
Yeah.
And the Germans, Kohl made his visit to Dresden on the 18th of 19th of December. And on the plane on the way back, I learnt this later from Tietmeyer, the Bundesbank, they decided that the only way to stop the exodus and to get the economy under control was to have a currency union, and which Kohl announced in early February at the same moment as the governor of the bank, Bundesbank, Pohl, was saying it was a bad idea. Or at least the way it was proposed to do it was a bad idea.
Yeah.
So the currency union was proposed in February and was fixed for the 1st of July. At the moment when the currency union was proposed, effectively, that meant that the future course of the country was settled, and that meant that in practice, unification occurred on the 1st of July.
Yeah.
On the 18th of March, there were the first and only free and fair elections to the East German parliament. Most people had expected that the SPD would do extremely well, but they didn't do all that well. A coalition of parties led by the CDU, which were promising rapid unification under Article 23 of the Basic Law of West Germany, which says that other German Länder can accede to the Federal Republic, won the day. And thereafter, the West Germans said they would only negotiate with East Germany once there was a democratically elected government, which there was after the 18th of March. At the same time, the settlement of the external aspects of unification was conducted in what became known as the 2+4 negotiations. Why 2+4 and not 4+2? We'd had 4+2 in the 1950s, and the Germans were determined at this time they were going to be in charge.
Right.
I may say that the British Foreign Office legal advisors devised the framework for what became known as the final settlement with respect to Germany. And it was the final settlement of what? It was the final settlement. It was the substitute for a peace treaty.
Yeah.
That never happened after World War II. And it was important not to call it a peace treaty, because at that point the Jewish lobby in the United States Senate would have piled in and said no ratification unless there's oodles more money for Jewish interests in Israel and so on. And that was all wrapped up. Of course, there was the Einigungsvertrag with West Germany, and then there was the final settlement, which was concluded, not without some hiccups, in Moscow on the 12th of September, just a year and 2 days after the Hungarians opened their frontier.
Wow. It's amazing how, as you say, it's amazing how quickly it happened and how peacefully it happened.
How quick and how peacefully. Yeah, that's right. Yes, yes. And then the final denouement, in a way, was the conference of the CSCE conference in Paris in November, which produced the Charter of Paris for a new Europe, and NATO and the Warsaw Pact declared that they were no longer hostile to each other, and it was decided that the CSCE process would now be endowed with institutions, including an office for free elections, an economic forum, and it was agreed that, and of course there were already building blocks in the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe was signed, and peace and friendship forevermore was proclaimed, promptly torn apart in Yugoslavia, of course.
Yeah.
And while she was at the conference, Mrs. Thatcher was deposed by her own party in November 1990. She was actually in Paris when she learned the results of the first vote, where she won, but only narrowly.
Yeah.
That conference closed down the Cold War and the Iron Lady's career.
Yeah. Yeah. No, incredible times, and an incredible story you've given me there, particularly the background of some of the negotiations that were going on. I mean, that was really interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. Good. I'm glad it was of some help.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I had one last question, and it's just about, did you have much contact with UK nationals living in the GDR at the embassy?
Well, there weren't very many of them. And there were some who sort of kept their distance because they were sympathetic to the communist regime and all the rest of it. I mean, to tell you the truth, I cannot. There was one very prominent newspaper correspondent who was hanging around. It's called Anne McElvoy. Do you know her?
I've heard of her. I've seen some of her books. Yeah.
Yes. And then, there was one. One of my to this day, my great friend, the Reuters correspondent. He was a man called Martin Nazerki. And what had happened to him was, he was the Reuters correspondent, fluent Russian speaker. He was the Reuters correspondent in Moscow when there was one of these sort of spy swaps.
Yeah.
Scandals and swaps and mutual kicking out of people. And he got booted out of Moscow. And he arrived, and so Reuters posted him as a sort of consolation prize to East Berlin. And he arrived at around the same time as I did. And and Martin was a terrific sort of Kremlinologist. He could work out what was going on by how many lights were on in the central committee building at what time of night and so on. He had a terrific range of contacts and a great knowledge of the Soviet system and so on. And so he was resident in East Berlin. And our friendship picked up again later when he became the OSCE Secretary General's spokesman. And by this time he had a Korean wife. And then he later I was one of his referees, and he became Ban Ki-moon's chief spokesman.
Okay.
And now he's back as head of UN Information Services in Vienna. So he was resident in the GDR. But but one of our big tasks was East Germans who had got married or who wanted to get married to British citizens and were trying to get out. And so we always had a list of sort of family unification cases, which we presented to the East Germans before each and every visit. And we said, if you want X, you're going to have to let out the following people.
Right.
And we, with persistence and so on, we were successful in some cases, but not in all.
Yeah.
Oh, and we had a few lectors, under the cultural exchange program, teaching English at East German universities. Quite a few of them in the end. Yeah. So there was, but it was a very small community, really.
And we have further photos, videos and information on this episode in our show notes, which will show as a link in your podcast app. Now, this podcast would not exist without our generous Patreons, and I would like to especially thank our Politburo level members who contribute a generous $30 a month each to help keep us on the air. They are Tony Sowards, Sam Hardwick, Nicholas Butter, Jeffrey Jones, Matthew Comstock, Frederick Esposito and Peter Ryan. Don't forget, if you'd like to get one of those Cold War Conversations coasters, help keep us on the air, then head over to coldwarconversations.com/donate. If you can't wait for the next episode, do visit our Facebook discussion group where listeners just like you continue the Cold War conversation. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thank you very much for listening. It is really appreciated. Goodbye.